Greetings and welcome to Bloomberg New Economy Conversations, the series where we explore how businesses and governments around the world are responding to the coronavirus pandemic. Today's conversation, The Great Urban Do-Over, will focus on the challenge faced by cities as they rebuild from the COVID catastrophe. We'll discuss how cities can use this crisis as an opportunity to reimagine a healthier, greener, and more equitable urban life. As always, we've got a stellar lineup of speakers to talk us through this epic urban makeover. Today, I'm joining you from New Hampshire, and I'd like to welcome our global community of Bloomberg New Economy delegates who've attended the forum in Beijing and Singapore these past 2 years. We also welcome the thousands of viewers tuning in on social media and via the Bloomberg terminal. There will be opportunities throughout this conversation for real-time input from you, our audience. I encourage you to submit questions in the text box in the bottom right of your screen, and I'll invite you to vote in live polling in the top right of your screen. If at any point you encounter technical difficulties, a simple refresh of your browser should help get things back on track. And now let's get to our first interview. We're going to kick off today's program with a fire starter conversation I pre-recorded with Yu Liang, who is the chairman of Vanke, a Shenzhen, China-based residential real estate developer with properties in more than 60 mainland Chinese cities and operations in Hong Kong, the US, UK, and Malaysia. Take a listen to our conversation. Chairman Yu Liang, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. China was one of the first countries in the world to emerge from COVID-19 lockdowns. In what ways do you think the pandemic has changed life permanently in Chinese cities?
疫情对于中国城市的影响是方方面面的。那么如果说到永久性影响的话呢，我就有一点不得不说的，就是一个城市的韧性问题。也就是说，一个城市在面对一个极端突发情况底下，如何保持城市的一个不停摆，如何保证人们的生活能够不要中断，所以这点影响呢，我们称作城市韧性，它就对抗这种极端风险情况底下还能保持正常运作的一种能力。比如说我们呢做万科有物流业，我们发现呢有些城市在之前物流规划做得比较好，那么之前的应急准备比较充分，它的配送的体系比较完整，所以这样的城市呢，在疫情面前呢，它的抗疫的物资准备啊、调配等等的非常顺畅。那么也有些城市这方面呢，过去不太重视，所以现在疫情之后呢，正在做这样的补救措施。再比如说呢，以前呢，对物业管理，每个项目物业管理来看的话呢，其实人们这一边都有问题在于说，疫情之后就发现这些客户这一边既离不开快递。因为呢，只有快递能解决他的日常生活所需，但是呢，他又害怕跟陌生人接触，所以需要物业管理公司呢提供这最后1公里的服务，所以物业管理公司重要性就变得更加突出。这些方面，我觉得城市这一边可能应对突发事件打击这种韧性问题，成了这个城市未来疫情之后，我觉得中国城市面对的一个要补的一个很大一课。
In Western countries, many predict that working from home will become the norm. What's the experience in China? Are office workers reluctant to go back to long commutes? Are businesses more flexible about where their employees work?
其实没有任何人会喜欢把时间浪费在长途通勤方面去的，所以说企业这一边的话呢，一定会是一种多元的一种环境，但不只是说居家办公这么一个居家办公这么一种模式。我们自己万科呢，我们有在几十个城市都有自个的业务，有很多的10几万的员工。我们就发现呢，调查发现的挺有意思的。有些员工呢觉得特别喜欢居家办公，因为他觉得可以减少大量通勤时间，然后的话呢，还能养成了培养写工作日志啊，提升彼此之间提高整个工作效率。这部分人很喜欢。有一部分人的话呢，他们不喜欢居家办公，他们觉得不应该把工作带回家里去。而且的话，原来的住宅呢都没考虑过办公需求，所以这个点上来说的话呢，会造成，而且那个时候疫情期间呢，老人小孩也都在家里面，所以这样的话，他觉得这种错乱感、这种割裂感，使得他们觉得还是回传统办公室更好一些。 那么当然也有些同事觉得也很有意思，但是他会觉得说，哎，如果团队有新成员，远距离的沟通，包括视频也好、电话也好、邮件也好，不能取代面对面这种亲近感。尤其一个团队新成员来的时候，光打个电话并不知道他的脾气啊、他的爱好啊、他的兴趣点啊，就这样的不容易建立团队之间默契啊。所以说，我觉得一个企业来说，可能需要面对这么多不同需求的员工呢，提供灵活多元的办公方式，我觉得可能是我们的选择吧。
Do you think business travel will come back in China? In the US and other countries, executives are finding that Zoom calls are almost as good. What's the experience in China?
当然出差是已经恢复了，我过去3个月已经走了几十个城市了。那么但是呢，我们04年的时候就开始启用远程办公体系。那么我们在疫情期间的话呢，我们大量的运用了远程办公的体系。那么疫情是加快了这么一种普及程度，但仍然是说，我想说呢，我们这种远程办公体系不能解决面对面不能取代面对面的沟通跟交流比如说呢，你去现场去看这个项目，可以看得更加全面，可以看更多的细节，这是远程办公系统是不能解决的问题。再比如说呢，每个城市你有些新的业务合作伙伴，你不跟他去见面交流一下，也很难彼此建立一种信任关系。你知道，在中国如果没有人跟人不熟悉，没有信任关系很难做生意的。再比如说呢，你通过跟员工去面对面交流，才知道说他们的状况如何，精神面貌如何。你只是远程系统一个点对点的沟通不能解决这样的问题。尤其确实也是一些新的团队的时候呢，他也希望得到说一些管理者的想什么。在这个情况之下，这种当面的交流呢更有亲近感，所以我觉得科学的进步，我们沟通方式更多，但是呢，沟通的更多也更需要面对面的交流。
There's a lot of talk these days about 15-minute cities in a post-COVID world, making everything accessible within an easy walk or bicycle ride as a way to make urban life safer, cleaner, and more sustainable. I know Vanke is working on a similar concept. Tell us about that.
关于15分钟城市呢，确实是个非常有趣的概念它大概意思指的是说，在一个人力所能够到达的范围内然后呢解决职业生活工作平衡问题，能够在这么个小的尺度内，能够解决人们日常生活所需的各种方面的问题。那么确实觉得这个是15分钟，还是5分钟，还是30分钟，可能每个情况不太一样。比如说在新加坡因为它天气特别炎热，又是城市比较紧凑，所以他谈5分钟的那个城市圈的问题，城市单元问题。对于万科来说呢，这个万科正在研究课题，我们叫未来理想城市单元的研究。那么这未来理想城市的单元研究呢，我们主要是包括3个内容第一个内容的话呢，确实需要适宜的尺度，不能太大它能够在这个尺度内解决人们日常生活所需要各种东西。第二的话呢，要混合多元，它不能解决工作问题，还解决生活问题，还解决它的娱乐的问题、购物的问题，包括比如休息的问题等等。还有第3个维度呢，叫生态可持续。那么生态可持续指的是说，这个理想单元才能够更加宜居。比如说我们在采用的规划里面的话呢，我们主张呢，有些最大可能减少对土地的占用，更多土地留给自然跟环境。那么这个情况底下呢，那么局部的高密度开发可能是需要的局部高密度开发又有利于人们之间交流跟沟通也从而提升工作效率。所以这是我们正在做的城市单元的研究，理想城市单元研究。
Thanks to Vanke Chairman Yu Liang for taking the time to join us. Now I'd like to introduce our 4 guests for today's live panel discussion. Greg Clark is the Global Head of Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC Group. He's also the Chairman of the Connected Places Catapult, a board member of Transport for London, chairing its investment committee, and an honorary professor in urban innovation at University College London and Strathclyde Universities. Welcome to the program, Greg.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Diane Hoskins is the Co-CEO of Gensler, an integrated architecture, design, planning, and consulting firm based in San Francisco, California. She's also co-chair of Gensler's board of directors and the global governing trustee for the Urban Land Institute. Thanks for joining us, Diane.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here.
Jan Vapaavuori is the mayor of the city of Helsinki, Finland. Previously, he worked as vice president of the European Investment Bank, and prior to that, he was a member of the Finnish parliament, and he served as Minister of Economic Affairs from 2012 to 2015, and as Minister of Housing from 2007 to 2011. Thanks for being here today, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure joining you.
Martin Villig is the co-founder of Bolt, formerly known as Taxify, which is the leading mobility platform in Europe, serving more than 30 million users in over 35 countries. He's a leading figure in the Estonian startup community, having co-founded Estonian Startup Leaders Club and Garage 48 Foundation, which organizes hackathons all across Europe. Welcome to the program, Martin.
Glad to be here. Greetings from Tallinn.
Okay, before we drill down into some of the issues I raised with Chairman Yu, I'd like to start off with a set of quick round-robin questions. First, I'd like to ask each of you to identify the single biggest problem that you think COVID-19 has exposed in how our cities are built and run. There are lots of candidates: long commutes, pollution, inequality, access to healthcare, racism. Pick one. Diane, maybe we should start with you.
Wow. I guess the answer would be all the above, really. But if you have to pick one, at the end of the day, and again, being a designer and an architect and focused on the built environment, I guess what, kind of keeps me up at night is the fact that our buildings, which are so vital to who we are, what our cities are all about, vitality of our economy, that our buildings actually created risk for us during this pandemic. So that, I believe, is a massive problem that we need to address.
Martin, can you hear us? Single biggest problem that you think COVID-19 has exposed in how our cities are built and run?
Yeah, sorry, there was a break, but I'm back now. So, what do we see as a transport side? Definitely is that we see in many, basically all global cities, people are commuting to the city in the morning or through the city. And now during COVID, we actually saw that majority of people stay home and the world and the business kept running. So the main question we see is that why should people commute that much, and then especially in the peak hours in the morning and evening? So how we can design the cities altogether better, and so similarly to as you was mentioning in the previous interview, how we could elaborate this 15-minute city concept. So we are true believers that should be something for the next 10, 15 years to all the cities to consider.
We're going to get back to that 15-minute city concept, but first of all, Greg, single biggest malady, urban malady that you think COVID-19 has exposed?
Well, like Diane, I think all of the above, and I think particularly the revealed inequalities that have been apparent as a result of COVID-19 are stark. But let me plump for a different one and say, I think it's the rigidity of the way that we have organized our cities so that there is a lack of flexibility in how we organize our time in the city, how we organize our space in the city, and how we organize transport. So rigidity is the biggest challenge that's been uncovered.
And I don't want you to criticize your own city necessarily, but what do you think is the greatest shortcoming that COVID-19 has exposed?
I always protest when you are asked to mention one single thing which is like most important in a very complicated world. I very much believe in a comprehensive approach and a holistic view in the idea that actually everything counts. I do think that the biggest reason why some cities, including Helsinki, has been able to handle the COVID-19 crisis relatively well is that in our cities, people trust authorities. We are like trust-based societies where people, for example, follow restrictions because they trust the society. So you put it I mean, the conclusion is that the biggest problem, which if I need to mention only one, is that people do not trust each other, people do not trust societies, authorities, and that is the biggest single problem. Of course, then why they do not trust the authorities and the society, it's a more complicated issue. And there I would like to refer what Greg talked about, inequalities.
The countries where you have the greatest trust in government, many of them in East Asia, have done the best in combating the pandemic. Second quick question before we get to 15-minute cities. A lot of doomsayers now. People are saying New York is finished, that COVID-19 is going to empty out our cities. Is there anything that you've seen in this pandemic that has shaken your belief fundamentally in the outlook for cities? In other words, where are the risks? What should we be worried about? Mr. Mayor Jan, let's start with you.
I think that no other epidemic in history has been successful in ending the great global transformation of urbanization. I don't remember which year it was and what epidemic, but we have seen in the world history that more than half of the London population has died. I do believe that the dynamics behind urbanization is so strong for several reasons that I'm like not. I don't see actually any other opportunities, but certainly it will reshape the say trend of urbanization in many ways, and there I think that many cities need to make some major changes in order to convince their citizens, in order to convince especially foreign investors and so on to put their money in the city. And there I see actually possibly a trend from all the time growing some few megacities towards a world with a trend towards middle-sized cities, which are like big enough to have all the strengths and advantages of a metropolis and a urban settlement, but not all the weaknesses which the very most biggest cities have.
Greg, I know you're an urban optimist. Anything that you've seen has shaken that optimism at all?
Well, I think the thing that most shakes my optimism is the speed with which the global media wishes to pronounce the death of the city. And that surprises me every time I read these headlines, because I simply don't believe it. And I simply think the evidence of many thousands of years tells you otherwise. COVID-19 is a major accelerator, it seems to me, of trends that were already in place. And one of those trends is urbanization. But I think the shape and form of the urbanization that we will get in the future will be different, more distributed, more hybrid, more blended, and that brings with it some risks. One risk is the risk of segregation. Another risk is the breakdown of trust, as the mayor says, between citizens. And then I think there's a very big risk of some cities going bankrupt and being fiscally unable to cope with the changes that are required. In other words, what COVID does is to place an imperative of high levels of adaptability on our cities. Some of them can afford it, some of them can't.
Diane, you're sitting in a city that is grappling with many of the issues that Greg has just identified. What's your sense of the outlook? Are you pessimistic, optimistic? Where are the vulnerabilities in our cities?
Yeah, this is such an important conversation because the pandemic really impacted our cities in a deep and vital way. In fact, I saw some data to the effect that, I don't know, it was 70 to 80% of all COVID cases in the world are in our cities. So our cities really took the brunt of this pandemic, and our cities are feeling the consequences. And so, the future of the city is, something that should be talked about. I like your points about, wow, it's amazing how quick the media has declared the death of the city or the death of the workplace or a number of these things, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a moment. But, we actually did a survey. We're a large architectural firm, and we believe in the impact of design in all aspects of life. And so we do a huge amount of research around trends, what's going on, to be able to base our designs and even how we're influencing and advising our clients is based on more than just kind of immediate conversations. So we actually recently did 2 surveys to have some time series in it during this quarantine, during the pandemic. The first was in April and the second was in August. And we surveyed people in 4 cities, New York, San Francisco, London, and Singapore. And just to kind of talk about this issue of, are people interested in leaving the city? Are people, planning to leave the city? Actually, in New York and San Francisco, it was close to 25% of the respondents were indicating an interest and a serious consideration of leaving their cities. It was lower in London and it was much lower in Singapore. I think a lot of this has to do with, some of the factors of how the pandemic has been handled and other, probably social factors as well. However, when you got underneath why these individuals want to leave the city, it's not because of the health issues, it's because of economic issues. I think what is happening is the fact that people are losing their jobs. There's, again, kind of a realization of, gee, I'm doing everything at home, and home is really not it's a small place. I'm living here with 3 other people to be able to afford it. Kind of these realizations of why, are there other options? Are there other ways to live? So, again, it's driven more by the economics of the situation rather than COVID as a health issue. But COVID certainly is the catalyst for some of the extreme economic pressures that people are experiencing. The other kind of breakdown of that is that the largest cohort interested in leaving the cities is Gen X. And, again, so that starts to speak to, stage of life issues and all of that. But then there's, where do people want to move? And that was probably one of the most revealing parts of this. And this kind of goes back to the conversation about the 20-minute city and, this walkability and knowability of where you live. The kind of in order of preference was smaller cities, suburbs, and rural areas. And so again, it's this desire to have less density, possibly more walkability, ease of, getting to and from the things that you need to live your life.
Martin, what is your data telling you that would either support or refute this idea about the death of cities that allegedly is being promoted by the media?
Well, our data currently doesn't show it. So yeah, during March and April, we definitely saw a big decline in all the rides where people were locked at home. So that's a common knowledge. But actually, what we see is that recovery in our cities, more than 150 cities in Europe and Africa, the recovery is actually very fast. So we are now back at the pre-COVID numbers, and then several cities are already doing record numbers. So yeah, saying that cities are dead, I think it's too much. But of course, cities are different. So as was explained earlier, then the mega cities or the medium-sized cities or smaller ones, the life quality and everything is very, very different. But what we see is what COVID triggered was people asking a lot of more serious questions, why and how. So should I really behave and act as I did previously, or if now the new norm and everyone understood that the needs are changed and we can cope with the new standards, then that puts a new pressure now for the next elections in all of the cities, what the politicians and the new mayors are seeing. We actually start seeing more cities within cities. So that's roughly the same 15-minute concept. So that we don't take city as a whole, but we start looking at it as a smaller cities inside a bigger group, and what are the living conditions there. So I'm a really big fan of Tallinn, which is 500,000 city, and it's very easy to commute here within electric scooters, bikes, and also many people walk here. But on the other hand, we have free public transport, but some people still prefer cars, or I would say actually more than half of people prefer cars. So this should be obvious choice, but people still don't use public transport that much as they should. So those are the challenges we currently see that are happening, and yeah, people are starting to rethink more and questioning the status quo and actually becoming more and more active themselves of actually influencing the cities, and now pushing to be more friendly and to ask more clean air and more parks and forests and so on. So that's what we see.
Greg, what's your take on the 15, 20 minutes city? A good idea? What would it take to retrofit a city like London to fit into this framework? How will cities be able to afford this kind of remodeling?
Well, I think it's a very interesting idea, Andy, because essentially it's trying to create a city that's centered more around what the citizen wants, how she or he experiences their city, and it's a drive to relocalize the city. I don't personally believe that this means, as Martin was just saying, this is not just something for small cities or medium-sized cities to do. Big cities can also become 15-minute cities. And I've been involved in conversations about these things in Sao Paulo and Shanghai and many other places. What does it require? It requires attention to urban amenities by city leaders. They have to think about what we might call high streets or town centers or district centers or precincts, how to get the right mix of amenities there so that many of these things are local. It requires attention to mobility systems so that there are walkable and cyclable facilities. To people in European cities, these things are totally obvious because they've had them forever and they never lost them. But in cities that have never had them, these appear as a magical new ingredient that has just been discovered for the first time. And that's quite funny. But it also requires our big city centers to adjust. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is how did the existing city centers, the big CBDs, the office blocks and everywhere else, how do you get a 15-minute version of a CBD? So part of that is certainly about more people living in the downtowns. And just as Diane was speaking about the people who are going to leave the city, of course, the history of the city is that people are leaving the city all of the time. It's just that many, many more people are coming to the city all of the time. And therefore, I think there's a big opportunity here for us to think about how we mix up the uses of our land and our buildings to create more mixed-use CBDs and get different versions or different formats of the 15-minute city in different parts of the big cities as well as in the small and medium ones. I think it's a really exciting challenge, and it's going to drive a lot of innovation.
Mr. Mayor, Helsinki aspires to be, and I quote, the world's most functional city. You define that to mean that, among other things, child daycare is close at hand, children feel safe walking to school, services for the elderly are easily accessible, and road work is carried out so as to cause minimum disturbance to residents. Assuming that you've lived up to these ideals, you already have basically a 15-minute city. What did it take to get there?
If you allow, I'd like to start with coming back shortly to the discussion of the end and death of cities. It's a obvious case that we today discuss the effects of COVID-19, but I do believe that actually climate change and digitalization will transform the world more profoundly than COVID-19 is. And especially from a sustainability point of view, the alternative to urban settlements would be a sustainability catastrophe. And that's why I don't see any other option. Then coming to Helsinki, we are not maybe a 15-minute city, but we are a half an hour city. And of course, it is much easier to develop a half an hour city if your population is 600,000, more or less the same than it is in Tallinn. But then, of course, it is also very much built on the idea that like everything works. The main idea behind the most functional city is that just everything works. It simply works. I talked to a Belgian CEO who spent some time in Helsinki, and he told me that the biggest strength of the city was that he did not know any other city of same size where he could put his 7-year-old daughter walking alone to the school, and he was never afraid that he would lose an airplane due to traffic jams. So I mean, it is a combination of a huge amount of different things which need to be in place at the same time. Then very shortly, I would like to echo what the chairman of Vanke said here, the interview in the beginning. I do believe strongly that we are living in a world where everything which can be digitalized will be digitalized, but everything which can be digitalized can also be copied. And what can't be copied is human interaction between people. And that's why it's so crucial that we are able to create either like smaller or medium-sized cities where you have the natural opportunity for human interaction, or then like sub-cities within big cities where you create that kind of 15-minute cities.
Martin, when people talk about 15-minute cities, they emphasize walking, cycling, and public transport. There's no mention of ride-hailing. In fact, the whole idea is to eliminate cars. What's the future of your business in this kind of city? What are your options?
Yes, in such an environment, transportation platform like Bolt should and will become a multi-modality platform. So that means that the need for personal cars is actually decreased a lot compared to where we stand today, which in most Western cities, people have 1 or 2 cars for the family. So if we now look at the younger generation, they have already understood that. So in many markets, the average age of applying for a driver license is growing from 19 to 25 or so. So that clearly shows that people don't already need that much personal cars. And what we can then do is in these smaller district areas where the city has developed a reasonable bike lines or overall infrastructure for micromobility. We can run the city bike systems, the electric scooters, shared cars, and of course ride-hailing, which is all then mixed with the public transport, so that you can put in a destination and we give you 3, 4, 5 different options depending of are you in a hurry, what group size are you traveling with, or do you prefer more greener or private or shared vehicles, and all of that. So basically we still see that the need for transportation in a city will not disappear, but it will just change. And people still also move between these districts, so that it's a nice miracle, but no one will ever be able to fully live in these bubbles. We would be really happy if children can walk to the schools and kindergartens in the same district, but some of their parents still need to work in another places, which is services or some of the other things where you need to be there in person. So there we see that our role of current, let's say, car-centric transportation in ride-hailing will just transform into more multimodal systems, and this is what we are also trying to tell the cities and help them to rethink that kind of thing. And of course, sharing the data is important, so that cities would actually understand where people currently move and how using our data and using their own data, they can plan these districts better and transportation between those districts as well.
On that note, I'd like to bring in our first audience poll to see how our audience views the idea of commuting. Question: if you gave up your car, what would be your preferred option for commuting to work? Walking, here are the options: walking, scooter, cycling, public transport, ride-hailing app. While we're waiting for the audience to submit their answers, Martin, very briefly, what kind of infrastructure do you need that you currently don't have in cities in Europe that will enable your last mile solutions? Where should city governments be focusing their investments?
I think that we are still in process of fully doing the research about the bike lines and lightweight infrastructure. But what we see is that still majority of cities are built around cars, and they take up majority of spaces. So that's parking spaces, the highways, the roads, and so on. And there are some good examples. I would say Sweden or Amsterdam or Denmark, that everyone is well known that these cities are very bicycle friendly. But there are many cities that aren't, especially also in Eastern Europe and some of the Western European cities as well. So their cities should exactly take the data where people are moving, what are the patterns, why they are moving, and then build the lightweight micromobility infrastructure. So it should be separated. We see that cities are now trying to start mixing. So London have done a lot of shared bike and bus lines, but we still see that it's not that safe in a way that it should be more separated, so people would actually feel secure that even kids would be able to use those lines. So it should be separated by some kind of infrastructure or borders or something like that. So that is really important, and it would be similar and also mixing with the public infrastructure. So the bus stops and metro stops and so on, it will be connected and reasonably going to smaller suburbs and districts. So this is what we see is really needed to boost that kind of new revolution.
Okay, the results of our poll are in. Hands down favorite walking. I'm not sure what these answers say about your future of your business lines, Martin. Not much interest at all in scooters, which is very interesting because I'm going to put up a graphic in a second that suggests an alternative scenario there. Cycling, public transport split the vote. Ride-hailing app only 7%. So let's put up this graphic now, which was an online survey led by the University of Amsterdam urban planning researcher Ori Rubin in April during the lockdowns. He asked the question, do you miss commuting? And the results are pretty interesting. People who drove cars pre-lockdown didn't really miss driving cars at all. But what people really missed were their e-scooters, and they missed their walking commute, public transport somewhere in the middle. Let's go to our first audience question. This one comes from Katie Egeland, and she's an insights analyst at Sony Interactive Entertainment in Alameda, California. She asks, what does the future of commuting look like? How can the US continue to move toward denser development with less car dependence in the post-COVID world? Diane, can you have a go at that one?
Sure. There's so many layers of that question. Just the word density and increasing density is definitely a huge conversation right now in all arenas. And whether or not cities should be dense, and is it really more about crowding and insufficient infrastructure rather than the density itself? And so, again, at the end of the day, I think what we would say is that, we need to address this whole issue of how cities are designed. In this conversation, I want to kind of go back and, pardon me, listener, I want to go back to a little bit of the 15-minute, 20-minute neighborhood concept. This idea actually has been around for over 100 years. And it tends to land over in the utopian conversations about idealism and wouldn't it be great if, and certainly there are places where it exists, but lots of places that can't check all the boxes to that level because of a lot of dynamics that are going on in cities. But what we've started to see is, again, if we go back to some of the earlier conversation around social equity, and, all of what has been happening, and certainly in the United States, is the epicenter of this awakening and the recognition that we can't have healthy cities unless we deal with these issues. And it's not going to be another turn of the dial and see how far we can get before it erupts again. It's dealing with it now. And, strategies now that are starting to take this idea of, the 15-minute city and bringing that into more of our urban areas and starting to, talk about issues of, deserts of essential services, deserts of economic opportunity, and how we can start to look at if we begin to address perhaps the urban core, which has the risk of let's say COVID. And again, I actually don't believe COVID is something that kind of comes and goes and we can just forget about it. I actually believe we've had an awakening, just like when, doctors figured out that they were the ones carrying the diseases to other patients. It was about washing hands, and we never stopped doing what we learned in that moment. And there are things that we're learning in this moment that we're going to need to carry forward. Part of this is how we work and where we work. And this idea of hub and spoke, which, is kind of a hand in hand with the 20-minute city. How do you begin to decentralize jobs and the economic engine of cities so as it's not concentrated, again, creating concentrated risk when we start to deal with these kinds of contagion issues. And, getting back to the mayor's comment about climate, we have to begin to look at how we design office buildings, how we balance the demands of the grid, how can the grid support again, the demands of our commercial activity as well as all of the activities that are needed. And that starts to be addressed when you look at decentralization of economic activity, decentralization of commercial activity, creating neighborhoods in all areas of cities, not just some areas of the city, but literally when we talk about, in the United States, we might use the term the urban core or some of the, areas where, minorities live. How do we begin to really create the town centers in those areas as well? And again, building this notion of a walkable city for everyone or a scooterable city for everyone.
Mr. Mayor, Helsinki has been running experiments in micro mobility. What are the conclusions so far? And to Diane's point, what's the connection between micro mobility and what Diane was describing as a sort of decentralization or deconstruction of the urban environment?
It is very popular to talk about walking and cycling all around the world, and even in Europe, and even in cities where we have been where we have paid attention to those already for a longer time. But still, I would like to remind, and I strongly believe, that the core of a sustainable transportation system must be the public transport. So cycling and walking can never ever replace all the needs, and even not the major needs people have in moving from a place to another one. So a well-functioning public transportation system is the core of everything. And there I would like to echo what Diane said, that the way how we design the city is here the crucial issue. So actually you should try to, you could say, put it in this way, that the philosophy of a urban planning in Northern European cities is like creating a city where people use less their cars without deciding to use less their cars, and actually without even understanding that they use less their cars. So I mean, walkable cities, dense cities, nice cities, well-functioning cities where most of the daily needs are close enough, and where the city at the same time is safe, clean, and so on. They just happen to use less their cars. So I think the core in the long run is to design a city in a way where people walk more, cycle more, use more public transportation without even deciding to do that.
Here's an interesting question. It's just come in from Carmen Badeguez Browne, the educational director of Morris Campus Educational Farm, Inc. in New York City, asks, how do we get investors to support effective and proven organizations that are building sustainable urban farms in food desert areas and communities that have suffered and can continue to experience systemic institutional racism? Jan, do you have experience of urban farms in Helsinki, or would anybody else like to comment on to answer Carmen's question?
I think this must go to some of my colleagues now.
Greg?
Well, simply to say that urban farming and urban food is a major new trend in not just, as it were, reshoring food production where that's possible, but recognizing that urban food production is good for the environment, it's good for social capital, citizen cooperation. It's a great way to use pieces of land that don't need to be used for their current forms at the moment. So I see urban farming as something that's going to really take off. It's an area for citizen activism. City governments can mainly be enablers in this space, making sure that there's flexibility about how land is used. And businesses should get very interested in this from the point of view of staff attraction and retention. This is part of the ESG agenda, if I can put it that way. It's a way of bringing food supplies more locally to the city. Very important, of course, as we realize that through this pandemic, it's not only been the revealed inefficiencies in healthcare systems and transport and real estate, but the revealed inefficiencies of trade and supply chains, the revealed inefficiencies in healthcare systems are also pretty clear. So relocalizing food supply is a key part of that. I guess every country will have a different version of how you get business involved, but surely there's opportunities here for companies to benefit from being involved.
Greg, question from me. You've written a lot about the identity of cities, the stories that they tell about themselves. Cities are brands, and some of the biggest city brands are now badly tarnished. New York is a prime example. Others have done well. Seoul and Singapore, for instance. Are there winners and losers in that sense from COVID-19?
Well, it's a great question, Andy. And to be quick, I think it's too soon to say who are the winners and who are the losers. We're into second waves, third waves, and other things. But what's clear is that the cities that really understand what the city is for, what the core amenities are, what the relationship is between the city and its citizens, what its offer, its promise is, are better able to imagine a future beyond the crisis. So there's something about individual cities really knowing what their DNA is and being clear about what their very long-term offer is to the people who may wish to live there, invest there, and work there. So that's one point. The other point I would say, and it chimes a little bit with something we said earlier, is that I think this is not really a time for competitive city branding. I'm not particularly interested in whether Copenhagen beats Stockholm in a competition for an employer, or whether San Francisco beats San Diego in a competition for a research lab. It's much more important, I think, that we brand cities as a whole, and we define again the role that cities have played in civilization, in education, in social mobility, in environmental protection, in creating safety for citizens, in building systems and services of inclusion. In other words, we need to remember what cities are good at. And we need to talk about this much more confidently, because unless we're clear about that, the immediate and apparent challenges facing cities can seem insuperable. So I'm in favor of all of us getting behind the rebranding of cities as something that the 21st century needs.
Mr. Mayor, is the Helsinki brand intact? How do you even measure it?
I'd like to just start by telling that I fully agree with all what Greg said. My favorite title comes from 2,300 years ago. It was the great Greek philosopher Aristotle who said that people move into cities in order to get a job and earn their living, but they stay there in order to live a good life. And of course, the good life is a very personal issue, but there you need to understand that good life for your citizens means different kind of things, where the conclusion is that everything matters. I do believe that those things like safety, cleanliness, safe cities, clean cities, well-functioning cities, less corrupted cities, and so on. Actually, you could say all the Nordic European cities, that those kind of values will gain more importance in the future after COVID-19, and all those kind of cities will be among the winners in the future. Helsinki is a relatively small city. I don't know what the brand of the city actually is. Of course, we try to market our cities all around the world all the time, but I know that Helsinki is the capital of Finland, and Finland has been ranked as the most happiest city, happiest country in the world 3 years in a row. And why we are that, it is, you don't have a single explanation for that. The explanation is that we have few weaknesses and many strengths, and actually everything counts.
We're running out of time. I want to get to our second audience poll to get our viewers' take on the future of office work. How many days per week would you prefer to work from home? Every day? 3 days a week would be nice. 1 day per week? Never. I love the office. Okay. Diane, as we wait for these results to come through, as some of our speakers, including you, I think, have noted, the biggest trend coming out of COVID-19 has been digitization. Working from home is clearly an aspect of that. What do we actually know or think we know about the future of the office?
Yeah, this is the question of the day. So, we are the largest designers of workplaces globally, and we've been doing research on the workplace annually for the last 15 years through surveys. And so, when the pandemic hit and everyone was sent home in the quarantine, we decided to survey the U.S. worker to understand what that experience is about and what we can learn from it. And it was interesting because when our results came out in May, there was kind of a hands down, the office is dead, nobody wants to go back. Well, our survey of 2,500 workers across 10 sectors across the US showed that that wasn't exactly the case, that basically 70% of people would like the office to be their main place of work. Another 18% want to work only a small amount of time in the office, and 12% said they just wanted to work from home. And actually, that's the same percentage as just wanted to work from home before COVID as well. When you take it all apart and start to look at the why and the drivers of that, and people recognize that yes, there's kind of the social aspect, but getting their work done and the things that they need to do every day, knowing what other people are doing, the connectivity. We know all about the kind of things that happen, the unplanned meetings, the unplanned conversations, the things that aren't going to be on a Zoom call that you learn and that you connect with when you're in a physical space with others is just, again, very much missed. And in particular, the millennial generation. And, again, there's, explicitly, I'm not getting the mentoring, I'm not learning, I'm not entirely sure that what I did today exactly is what I need to be doing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these, and the chairman of Vanke spoke to this very well in terms of, what people are really experiencing and why they value the office. And, again, there's a lot of caveats around returning and this idea that the office needs to start to address some issues. So this kind of where the future is going to be is really an interesting mixture of all of what we're learning during COVID in terms of, health safety in the workplace, but also people are referencing things that actually were problematic pre-COVID. In particular, desk sharing and unassigned seating comes up over and over again as an issue that people are looking to have addressed if they're going to come back to the office. Only 10% of people want to have a desk, even if it is very clean, that someone else has just used. And, we know that some of that is from the COVID stigma, let's say, but at the same time, even before, our surveys from 2019 actually spoke to cleanliness as one of the key issues around desk sharing. And so again, not to go into too much detail, but we've also noticed over the years a diminishing of workplace effectiveness through continued densification. And this is the issue of, basically you can't, concentrate in the office. It's hard to find places to meet in. So this idea of over-densification is also coming up. And it's another issue that people are saying needs to be addressed if they're going to come back into the workplace. So this moment, this kind of, we hit the pause button, we all came home, we're dealing with all the issues of COVID and de-risking by social distancing and washing hands and the right HVAC systems and circulation patterns. but also it's given us that moment, just like in this conversation about cities, to really start to address things that weren't going so great before COVID. And how do we use this moment to make the workplace better? But just getting back to the core question, people believe they do their best work. Again, the majority of people believe that they do their best work with
Well,
other people.
that's interesting, Diane, because I think that's rather supported by the conclusions of our survey here. I think one of the most interesting results here, only 2% of people in our audience love the office so much they'd like to go back to it every single day. And in fact, 52% think that three days a week is perfectly enough. We really are running very, very short of time. We're almost out of time. Martin, you mentioned that in Estonia, work from home policies were the norm before the pandemic. What can Estonia teach the rest of the world about how to build this sort of hybrid work from home in office strategy?
Similarly, I think that how Estonia has been able to build all our e-societies is also related to trust, as was mentioned earlier. So that when government or when people trust their government, then they use the digital services and they think that they are reliable and so on. If people don't trust that, it's very complicated to actually build digital services and get major adoption from the people. So what we see is that on average, about 70% of population use digital signature on their daily lives, and that is also why you don't need to be in the offices or in government offices that often, so you can easily do all the stuff. So now we also have e-notary, which means that I can sell my property and shares and everything I need also remotely. So having this kind of infrastructure in place, what Estonia has had for the last 15 years, I think that is something what the other governments should review and try to learn, so that what are the cornerstones of digital society, and how Estonia could share our experience from tax declarations to electronic voting to signatures and starting a company in 20 minutes. So 99% of government services in Estonia are online, and all the, let's say, private businesses are just trying to follow that to be competitive and reasonable. So I would say that that's the norm we have here.
Final question. We are out of time. We're running over time. We can't leave this program without talking about leadership, city leadership. I'll come to you, Mr. Mayor, in a second, but I want to start with Greg. You've written a lot about leadership. Listening is an aspect of leadership. How do you get leaders to listen to the grassroots, the frontline workers, the people who've suffered disproportionately in this pandemic?
Well, Andy, first they have to want to do it, and they have to use the real media at their disposal, community organizations, local radio programs, citizen surveys, walking the streets and knocking on doors in a safe way. Leaders who are not connected to the people will not be able to lead their cities effectively. Digital platforms can help. But the key task for city leaders at the moment is to take what they learn from that interaction with the citizens to build trust. And trust comes both from the dialogue, but also from credibility. One kind of credibility is a proper plan for the future that delivers livability and delivers opportunity, jobs. Another kind of credibility comes from having realistic ways of financing the city, and that is a big challenge, but it needs major reform. We expect our cities to deliver so much, but we give them such limited financial tools with which to do it overall. And then the third area of credibility is, of course, about knowing how to deal with your neighbors. Most cities have a boundary which is arbitrary. Most of them need to form alliances with state governments, provincial governments, national governments, but also with the neighboring municipalities. Otherwise, we get this segregation effect where people crowd in to the municipalities with people who have the same income levels as them. We must avoid that. That's the segregation that is going to be the key challenge for city leaders going forward, I would say.
Last word to our own mayor on the panel. Mr. Mayor, what qualities do you think are necessary in city leaders battling their way out of this COVID-19 crisis?
It would be easy to say that I fully agree with Greg and I have nothing to add. But if I need to add something, I'd like to say that yes, trust are the most important factors. But then the rest is around the world of hope. So at the same time, you need create a society, a city which is based on trust, and there you don't have any silver bullet. It is a very comprehensive approach. It's a very holistic view. Everything counts, including the growing importance of the direct connection with the citizens and the leaders. But then, and especially during times like what we are experiencing at the time being, you need at the same time be able to create hope, to create hope to the future of the city, that people are proud of the city, that they love the city, that they are willing to make efforts in favor of not only themselves and their families, but for the whole society.
Trust and hope. We're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Greg Clark, Diane Hoskins, Jan Vapaavuori, and Martin Villig, thank you again for joining us today. We're grateful for your participation, for your perspectives. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Vanke Chairman Yu Liang for taking the time to join our conversation, and to our audience, both within and beyond the Bloomberg New Economy community. Thanks for joining us. We invite you to join us for our conversation next month on Building Back Greener, focused on the search for smart, sustainable infrastructure and mobility solutions in which governments can put post-COVID-19 stimulus funding to work. That's on Tuesday, October the 6th. Follow the conversation with @NewEcon Forum on Twitter, or like us on Facebook. And to learn more about other upcoming events, please visit our website at neweconomyforum.com. Thank you and stay well.